Okay guys, let's jump into some strategic budgeting. Today I'm going to take you guys on a short financial journey. It's important as you start preparing for 2024 that you really, dive deep into your overhead. A big part that I see when working with contractors is we really don't know what our overhead is, how much it costs monthly, weekly, for the year, we have no clue. And so it's really hard to plan for next year and figure out margins and markups and sales goals and all of those things if you don't know what your baseline cost for your business is going to be. Does everyone here have an overhead budget? Neighbor cat is a liar. An overhead budget, you know how much you spend a month just to stay open? Yeah. Let's talk about the components of building a general budget for 2024. You can turn to page 9 in your workbook. I have the same stuff basically laid out there. So, it starts with revenue forecasting. And really, that's built from historical data for your company, what you did this year, what kind of sales team you have, your sales team's data for this year, your lead flow. All of this goes into helping you build that revenue forecast for your company that becomes a fundamental basis for, how we're going to measure overhead and determine markup so that you can be profitable. You really need to know your project costs. Direct costs, project costs, kind of the same thing here. So you need to be job costing and doing those activities so that you have the data to make these decisions with. You need to know your overhead cost, you need to understand the profit margins, and then you need to understand your cash flow situation for your business, including that burn rate, like your actual cash outflow, which isn't always reflected in a P&L. You could actually have a green P&L and have a massive cash bleed and not even realize it if you're not tracking it. So all these components, Sam's like, yeah, that can happen. I'm profitable, but not on cash flow. All these things are super important as you start financial planning for 2024. So let's jump into understanding just cost. You have direct costs versus really overhead costs. So does someone want to tell me what direct costs are? Give me some examples. And you got a place to write them down. Anybody? Labor and materials. So we got labor and materials. What else? What's a direct cost in your business? What's that? It could be. It could be depending on your business. So someone like Swamp Rabbit, they're a moving company. Gas is a direct cost for their business. You could put it there. For me, in construction, it's overhead. You do landscaping, so like all your equipment, fuel, and all that, that could be determined as part of your direct cost. So then what are subcontractors is another one right there in direct cost. So you got subcontractors, labor, materials, all of those things that go directly into producing the product you make, whether that's widgets or shower doors or what do you... This is argued about in the industry, but it is a direct cost in my opinion. It is in my opinion, but I put it... Yeah, so like most people measure it in overhead, but it's a direct cost because it's a direct percentage of the revenue number, and that's the way to measure it. It's just a part of that project cost. If the reason that is, if projects go away, overhead continues. If projects go away, you don't pay the sales guy if he's commission only. So, it's going to be a lot of variety there in how you account for your sales guys. Not everybody's on straight commission like you roofers. So what are some indirect costs do you have? What are the overhead that you're measuring for your company? What's some examples of that? Rent. You're building marketing expenses, advertising. Insurance, a huge one. Now insurance can be both. So workers' comp's a direct cost. You don't have guys in the field working, there is no workers' comp. Well, yeah, you still got liability. Trucks, automobile, equipment, repairs, maintenance. Software, administrative, office staff, admin. So you see all these things, these line items, like we're naming out, there's way more line items here to be accounting for that are often missed. What do we miss, Dave? You got something else? Internet, utilities, all your utilities, cell phone bills, any kind of technology, GPS devices on your trucks, that's overhead. All that adds up, and so there's some areas there in that sheet to write down, and you can write down what your overhead costs are for your business. It's important that you understand, how all that goes into your business, because a lot of those overhead costs are going to be fixed costs. your rent's not gonna change no matter what you sell. And so having a comprehensive understanding of what your monthly overhead rate is for you to exist, whether you have projects or not, is super important. And then that's the number used to build your cash reserve, your emergency fund bucket, is to be able to keep your company running for at least 3 months of that overhead number during the lean times. So forecasting forward, there's really 3 big things that come into play here for each of your companies as you're looking at overhead changes, sales growth, all of those things. So you need to look at past data for your company is your most valuable piece of information for you to be able to do any kind of forecasting. Year one's gonna be the hardest to forecast when you start a new company. But if you look at the historical data, so I've been in business 9 years with my construction company, so I know what the overhead's gonna look like. You build out these things, but then you know what it looks like when you add a project manager for me. I know what my cost is gonna be if I need to add a project manager mid-year this year. I can start looking at that and how I grow. At what point do I need another project manager? All of these pieces of historical data come into play when you're building out your 2024 overhead budget. You could also do market research and economic indicators to look at external forces that are going to impact your sales and your growth and things like that. Maybe market rent's going to start sliding up on your commercial lease. So that might be something that you need to start weighing into your overhead budget for 2024. Most commercial leases are automatic increase anyway. So the first part of that, once you kind of have a sales figure in mind, is to nail in this overhead budget, which is a spreadsheet comes with this. And this is important to talk about, that it's not the same as your burn rate. So you hear the word burn rate talk about. Your burn rate for your company is how much cash outlay you have a month. There's a lot of things in the burn rate that are not included in like a P&L statement. So this is any cash you're spending on debt is not it's not an expense on your profit and loss sheet. So if you start paying down debt, there is no impact on your P&L, even though your cash flow goes way negative. So, yesterday, maybe this morning, one of these days, Mike was talking about making a big payment to his Amex card. Well, that's reducing debt, but there's no impact. He's already spent the money, the expense is already realized on his P&L when he incurred the debt. And now when he pays that off, he goes negative cash flow, but his P&L for the month's not gonna change from that. And so it's important to understand that, especially with accrual accounting. In cash-based accounting, it might be a little bit different, but accrual accounting, where you're factoring accounts receivables, accounts payable, and all that, you're not factoring in the cash implication of debt pay down. And so that's something that you have to be aware of. So as you're making that truck payment, only the interest is expensed. As you're paying, if you own a building, as you're paying your mortgage, only the interest on that is actually realized in your expense sheet. And so you really need to know those 2 numbers. You need to know your monthly overhead, but then you also need to know that monthly negative cash flow, that burn rate for you to stay in business. And so that becomes one of the metrics that you got to be hitting to stay in business. Does that make sense how, certain things do not show up on the P&L? Did you guys know that? Yeah, it's quick to look at a P&L sheet and think that's the picture of the business, but it only tells a part of it. It does not take into effect cash flow, and you can back it out through, like, if you had a balance sheet and a P&L, you can generate a cash flow. So as you go through this exercise today, the breakout's about building an overhead budget for Q1. There's things to consider. Look at your historical data, your past expenses. You could pull a P&L for just a single month and look at what you're spending on advertising a month. You can look at business growth and changes. Are you looking to scale this year? If you're trying to go from a $3 to $4 million company, what does that need? How many more salespeople do you need to bring on? Does that need another production manager, a project manager? Do I need another admin staff to handle the work volume? These are things that are going to be overhead expenses that you need to be planning for throughout the next year. Market conditions, seasonal variations, that's going to be a big one for like guys like Shane. How many months of the year can you not build roofs? 3, 6, 4? Yeah, so he's going to have overhead run rate through those months that are not very profitable cash flow months, and he's got to plan for that. And then importantly, you need to do some contingency planning. So when you're looking at building out your overhead budget, I encourage people to start building a buffer account. We talk about in Profit First, building a savings account, an emergency fund that could cover, 3 months of expenses. And the best way to build that is make that an overhead budget line item that, every month this dollar figure is going into that savings account. And then it may take me 3 or 4 years to get my reserve account up to the level it needs to be. But if you build that into your overhead budget, you know that you're going to be stockpiling money into that emergency fund so that in the lean times, or if some, a delayed payment, whatever, you have a cash reserve to pull from. So for me, it's like 3% of my revenue just dumps straight into an emergency fund bucket. Gross. So 3% of gross is part of my markup. So I'm in new construction, so I'm 42% markup. And then, 3% of that is just in that emergency fund bucket. 2% goes to employee bonus pool and benefits so that I can take my guys out and treat them. And then 10% straight to profit. So it's really 15% profit, but funneled out into different categories. Yeah. And so that's how I do it, so that I build that emergency fund. And once you have it built to do 3 months of overhead that you're constantly changing and keeping up, you don't have to keep diverting all that money to that. It could just dump over into your profit bucket if you're not spending money out of your emergency fund. But you got to have that cash reserve. So, for me, my run rate's like $27,000 a month, or was. Now it's less. So, I need 90 grand to have 3 months of overhead just sitting in a savings account. It's just there as an emergency fund. And now I've built that on 3% of my revenue over years of just putting back into that account. And some people are more aggressive. You can put half your profit in it, or whatever you decide to build an emergency fund. Do you have an emergency fund?
Yeah, well, it's not budgeted in. It's, I wanted to add smaller ticket items. Let's say service industry, average ticket $500 to $1,000 on a typical plumbing service. It's hard to put that 3% in, so it would probably be a monthly revenue percentage gross. Would be an easier way to account for that.
That's how I do it. So I do my transfers twice a month based on whatever revenue I brought in, whatever cash flow actually came in. So I do my transfers in the Profit First method based on actual cash flow. And that's how I make my transfers. You can build that into your markup, what are you marking up service, 100%? Yeah, so there's room in there for 3%.
Oh, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, it could be more. You could be 20%.
The Profit First is credit card transactions going to a separate account that I don't even touch, and then check deposits go into my actual operating
Yep.
checking account, and I don't touch the other one.
Yeah, that makes sense. I run Profit First. Who else runs a multi-account Profit First method? Yeah, if you have questions about that, come see me. I'd love to talk to you about implementing Profit First or a variation of that. I kind of took it a different direction, but it's the same principles. I don't have a revenue account and then go to operating. I go straight to operating or deposit account. Yeah, that's another one that's not in it's high cash flow, but not in your P&L. So when you receive a deposit, you got to account for that too. So that has nothing to do with your projections until you start realizing it and doing the work. These deposits are a liability. It's a IOU. So when you take in, I might take in a $150,000 deposit on a job, but until I actually start that job and realize that income, that's a liability. It's debt. I have borrowed money from that client in exchange for a service later. So I have taken on debt. So deposits are debt and should be treated as such. So I put all my deposits in a separate account until I start the job. So from that, I wanted to talk about markup versus margin versus multiplier, because I think all of these get very confusing. So let's use an example, and you might have to write it down. I do a job, I sell it for $10,000, and it cost me $5,000. What is my markup on the job? We got a 50%, an 80%. So it cost me $5,000, I sold it for $10,000. What's my markup? 100%. It's 100% markup. So I took my cost and I added 100%. Yeah. So then what's the margin? 50% margin. So it's easy to talk about markup and margin and get these terms confused. You know, when you're talking about margin, margin's about what's left, and markup's about what I added. And it's important to understand these terms so that you can teach your sales guys and don't get these things confused. Because, you know, if you want jobs sold at 50% margin and your sales guy goes and starts selling things at 50% markup, we're actually at like a 33% margin now. So it's important to distinguish that. So what the book Markup and Profit talks about is teach your guys to use a multiplier. And so a multiplier is a lot easier to not fuck up. So if the costs are 5,000, your multiplier is 2 to get to 10,000. And if your company runs on a 2 multiplier, that's easy. What are my costs? Times 2, that's what we sell it at. And so I'm a 1.42 multiplier in new construction. So I teach my guys, we get all our costs, times 1.42, that's our sales price. And so it's a lot easier to keep that straight in your head than how much margin am I getting? Okay, to get that margin, how much markup do I need? Just figure it out for your guys and run on a multiple. It's just a lot easier for your guys. And then we know that it trickles down. So you've got revenue minus all your direct costs leaves gross margin. Gross margin has to cover all of overhead and profit. And so all that's lumped in there. So if you're 50% gross margin, like Tom over here, he knows that, like, okay, out of that, if he wants 10% profit, he's got to keep his overhead budget in that 40%. And he's got to make sure all this lines up when he's doing his overhead budget and comparing it to sales and then looking at his monthly cash flow. If he brings in 100 grand this month and his overheads, he gets 50,000 margin, overhead's 40 grand, he's got 10 grand left for his net. So on the landing page, let me see. We're gonna go to a spreadsheet. So I built you guys a spreadsheet to make this overhead stuff a little more easy to approach. So on the landing page, on your badge, there's a link to an overhead spreadsheet. In our book, we have fake numbers. It's a fake company called James Remodel Service. We built a company for you guys to kind of see how it works and that there's slippage when you scale. So we got a $3 million company in 2023, and we're aiming to grow to a $3.5 million company in 2024. And I wanted to build you guys out some overhead projections so that you could see what that looked like. In it, there's a 2023 year company, 2024 projections. If you got your laptop and want to get it pulled up, it might be easier to see. Yeah, it's on the back of your badge. Get to the landing page. Somewhere on the left side, it says overhead worksheet. We'll ask you to make a copy so that you have your own copy of it. And then it has all these numbers already in it. So I gave you guys a sample 2023, 2024 so you can see the growth. And then it's got some blank pages so that you can fill in your numbers in the breakout. The goal is in the breakout that you look at Q1 and build out what your overhead budget is gonna be for at least Q1. So in this overhead budget, you know, there's no way you guys can read that from out there. You know, I break it down into a handful of categories. You've got advertising, office expenses, job expenses, vehicle expenses, general expenses, taxes, and then owner's pay, salary, or draw. One thing that one of my clients learned this way because I'm like, your P&Ls look so good, man, but you're telling me you have no money. What's up? And it's because owner's draws. Owner's draws you got to be careful with. They don't show up on a P&L either. So if you're a S Corp and you're taking a base wage and then you're writing yourself a check for 10 grand a month, that's not showing up on your P&L. And so your P&L could look really good, but you're actually draining the company dry because you're taking a draw every month. On this overhead sheet, I want you to put in your actual draw, W-2, and what you're planning to take out every month so that you can build that into your budget. You've got to account for that, even though the P&L is not going to show that. General expenses, I have things like insurance, interest, legal fees, education and training. So, you know, coaching is an overhead expense. Investing in coaching, training your staff, paying for your staff to be in coaching is an important overhead expense under education and training. So make sure you budget that as part of your overhead. You need to recapture coaching in your markup. So for anybody looking at this right now, what questions do you have about getting to an overhead budget? So equipment, let's talk about investing into equipment. You know, the thing that's tricky about equipment is, for the most part, it's an asset to asset conversion. So it's just a shift in your balance sheet of you're taking cash and you're turning it into a skid steer. It still retains value. It still is part of your balance sheet, and then you depreciate and all that stuff. But you really have to look at, if you're going to finance that, and that's a piece you need to acquire this year, what is the interest carrying cost of that piece of equipment, and break it down to an interest expense. So, under general expenses, I have interest expense. Maybe it's, you want a new T740 track loader, and it's going to cost $85,000, and my payment's going to be XYZ, and the interest on that a month's roughly this. That's what you need to start budgeting for on that, or look at the whole, the cash flow payment. You could dump that into your overhead too. But, a lot of that, do you usually finance that, or do you make a lot of cash and dump cash into them? Okay. Yeah, so then you're looking at the carrying cost as the interest is really what's happening, because that principal payment, you're just converting cash into another form of an asset as you pay off that debt. But you got to plan for that through the year, because you're going to have that increased carrying cost and interest. So you got to think, okay, are sales going to be in a place to support that? Do I need to start increasing my markup to support that increased interest? Those are questions to be asking yourself when you're looking at buying equipment, buying a new truck. That's going to be a common one for a lot of you guys. When you start adding vehicles to your fleet, there's a carrying cost to that, and you need to be budgeting, okay, like maybe you want to add another plumbing crew in June. Well, from June on, that's going to be part of your annual overhead budget for next year, and needs a higher markup to be able to accommodate that budget, because everything should be paid for out of the markup. You should pay all the business expenses out of the markup and have profit. You shouldn't take profit to pay the interest on a new vehicle. The labor? Yeah, but that's a direct cost. So that comes out of that's pre-margin. Yeah, so all this gets you to that place where you can eventually, the goal is to get to where like a pod, a unit, a van costs this much, and 2 guys in it costs this much, and what your burn rate is for that vehicle, tools, everything, versus what they can produce, production metric, and then that's the margin on that unit, that team. Dave talks a lot about that and getting to a systematic place where you're just moving the puzzle pieces around to be able to scale. So that, that's for you as a plumber, is like, okay, if I got 2 guys in a van, what's my cost in that versus the production? What do I need to be selling them at a month? What kind of volume do they need to produce to be a profitable crew? And then you start comparing crews, production rates, and things like that, because it won't be the same. But that's something to be considering, as you budget. Okay, well, to take on that crew, now sales, which is you need to sell, let's say 300,000 in business to have that one crew, or whatever it is. It might be way more than that.
Where are you putting field staff labor?
Field staff labor is a direct cost. So they come out of if your accountant sheet is set up correctly, you'll have revenue, then you'll have material, subs, field labor. And then in field labor should be a sub of what's the workers' comp for your field labor, what's all the cost that goes into your field crew guys, payroll expenses, everything. That's all a direct cost. And so you have to factor them up there. They come out before gross margin. So it's revenue minus all those guys leaves you gross margin. They are not part of your overhead budget. There are some situations where you could have some production guys be overhead. So like Bill Baker's not here, but he has staff that finish countertops. Like they cut and polish. They're in the shop all day, every day. It's a fixed rate. They might work on 20 kitchens today. They might work on 4, but he's got to pay them to be there all the time. So we actually built out his overhead budget to include his shop guys. So, maybe you have a maintenance guy, yard man, someone managing the yard. He's kind of in production, but he's overhead because he's there at the shop facilitating, just that part being done. So you might have some field guys that are on that side. Yeah, like a field super, a project manager, those guys could be overhead. Yeah, so I have a category for job expenses, and then there you have project managers. You could list out job super and build that into your overhead budget because, see, salary? Yeah. That's one way to look at it. Your salary guys, most of them are going to be overhead. What you got?
Yeah, it's hourly, but their hours fluctuate. Say during the build, they put in 60 hours that we would, when we're not building, they might do 34 hours.
What's their role? Like, what do they do?
For instance, like a project manager for a HOA, they're out there from the day we start in the morning until we finish. And if we're not building that week, they may be making sure the trucks are all running right, kind of doing small stuff around the office, so that when we get to the next job,
Yeah, so they're mostly project managing, but if they don't have work to do, they work around the office. Are they salary, they're hourly? How would you handle something like that, Dave? Or your project manager's field only? They're all, yeah, all mine are salary. Yeah. Yeah, so someone like that, one way you could do it in your overhead is get an average of how many hours they work for the year, if they're going to be kind of part-time, and figure out what an average week is to build that into your overhead budget. But usually project managers are leaning more towards the salaried side, and they're typically overhead budget. You could direct cost them, you could split the cost up. That's a lot of work, to track and keep track. I like simple. Just consider them overhead and just figure out what's an average quarter look like. You could look at a quarter and say, okay, how many hours do they work for the quarter? But then that's going to be into overhead. Come on, guys. You guys look so just training. I know. Put me in the afternoon. Oh, ask all the questions. You and me can have just a you and me conversation.
We can do this all day. It excites me because, it's the team, what you input to extract.
Yeah, Dave and I were talking about the importance of all this is, as you build processes in it, get your SOPs and everything dialed in, then everything becomes solely about the numbers. What does the data say? And then you start making decisions about your company based on having good data. So the right numbers, understanding what it means, understanding overhead and markup and margin and all these things helps you be able to make better decisions as a leader. And do you guys have a weekly financial review in your company? Does anybody check your numbers, do project review every week? We got 2. So it's, do you have numbers available every week? Okay. Because that's a big thing in the accounting world is it might take 2 months, 60 days to get your numbers. So I've got clients just now getting August numbers from their accountant. And so, that's an issue. You need to be able to have financial KPIs based on this. What's overhead running at? What's cash flow running at? Tom and I just built out a big thing for his business is what was the cash in versus cash out this week? We need to know every Friday how much cash we spent this week and how much cash came in. Because then we know, are we going in the right direction? Are we going backwards? And then he can plug the hole before the accountants can even get him the paperwork. So building out KPIs around these financial metrics so that you have the necessary information that you need. And it could be revenue for the week, sales for the week, cash flow in, cash flow out, all of these things like that. Could be weekly metrics, bi-weekly metrics, but building out systems and processes for your company to track, monitor, meet. For us, we meet every week on every project and do a financial review of where we're at, Where's the budget at? Is it on pace? Are we off pace? Why are we off pace? And what corrective action can we put in place to get back on budget? And so, that's an important part for us for project management is tying back in, because early on, we used to bid the project at a certain margin, do the project, pray at the end we made how much we thought, and then be like, well, we don't know what went wrong because we never hit the target. But by being able to track it on a weekly basis, and my projects I think my average project's about 8 months. And so we're tracking that every week. What have we spent on it? Are we in line with the budget? And how can we fix it if we're not? Or if we're ahead of budget, what do we see coming up that might get us off budget? And start forecasting for each individual project. So, we do a Friday project meeting to review the financials for every single project, and then look at the important stuff, the cash in, the cash out for the week, and things like that. Because, Clifton said it earlier, what gets measured gets managed. The Peter Drucker quote. Yeah. And so if you're not looking at it, if you don't have a process to do these financial reviews for your company, you have no clue you're flying blind. How often do you guys or your team? Yeah. Correct. Yeah, and your average job time length is what, a few days for, a day or two. Yeah, you're not gonna be able to track yours mid-project. Yeah, that makes sense. That could be one of your SOPs. We're gonna look at, after every job, did it hit the mark or not? If it didn't hit the mark, it gets on the list of we need to review these. Yep. Yeah, for us, it's project managers have to input all that. And then if it's off target, that's the ones we talk about. So workers' comp to me, for me, I pay so I'm with Builders Mutual, not an ad. They're buttholes. They will sue you quick, or at least send you lawsuit letters, like if you miss one payment, like 2 days later. And they'll argue with you about your audits. But yeah, it doesn't matter how good your data is, they're gonna find something. Be like, yeah, it's a scam. It's a modern day scam. But anyways, it's a percentage. So I know all my different trade categories. It's a percentage of what I paid out for that month. Now that we're 100% subbed out. So I pay clerical class code, project manager class, supervisor in the field class code. And then, I don't know, it's like they change that class code every time I talk to them to something else. And then I have like a concrete guy I use that doesn't carry workers' comp. If we paid him that month, it goes in that line. I hold it back out of his check. He reimburses me for paying that. But it's at the end of the month, I pay based on that number into workers' comp. It's a direct cost for me. Well, for my project managers and clerical, it'd be overhead. But then for all my, like the concrete guy, that's built into the price of the job as a direct cost.
Yeah, so like for my general liability workers' comp, umbrella, vehicle insurance, I'm $19,000 a year.
But is it a percentage of revenue or percentage of paid out for workers' comp too?
For workers' comp too, it's salary based for the plumbing category of workers' comp. So I'm just trying to.
If it's one payment, just lump it all into overhead and just know it's going to change as you bring on more employees. It's going to vary model to model.
So how would I use that number for markup for labor per job? How could I allocate that 20,000 divided by salary? Is it even worth getting that grant?
You could do it that way. You could have a burdened labor rate. And so you could allocate what the cost of workers' comp is. So my highest rate is general carpentry. It is 17%. It covers general, they try to lump everything in there, deck building, framing, whatever, general carpentry. And so I would just know that if I have a framer, I'm paying him $25 an hour, then it's 17% of that added on to that just to cover the workers' comp and then all the other taxes, fees to get to a burden rate, and that burden rate might be $38 an hour. And so my cost for that man in the field is $38 an hour. And that may be including 2 weeks paid vacation and all of that. You can build all of that into, an hourly employee's burdened labor rate.
That's kind of how I'm structured.
Yeah. You can build consumables into a percentage allocation for his burden labor rate. Like if you provide whatever, pencils for carpenters, their wood pencils could be part of your consumables budget. Clothes, or you can lump that into advertising. They're walking billboards. Does anyone have an expense they don't know where it goes? Ask my accountant. I've seen that quite a bit.
I do know one that we messed up for years we fixed was the finance charges. We saw a $20,000 project, it just say we have a $500 service fee. $19,500 deposited into our bank. And $500 expense we misclassified it wrong for years.
Where should you be putting it?
So what we're doing now is the money's coming in, you're going to undeposited funds, then going to undeposited funds, and then putting the fee on at that point there into, we labeled it as a bank fee.
Yeah, bank fee.
That part, then it's realized it's 19.5. Then it's actually deposited.
Yeah, because then you see the 20,000 and how it was all allocated, so it breaks down
Before we
correctly.
were bringing 20,000 in, and we had to discount 500 to make it mess it up for all.
Yeah, that's an easy one, especially with, like all the automated stuff. Like if you pay through Builder Trend, for example, it doesn't pass the fees correctly, and you got to make sure it's all allocated right. Yeah. It's part of your burn rate. Any payment on debt, owner's draw, those are going to be the two that people mess up the most. Other things that don't show up on balance sheets, buying equipment. Like if you go out and buy a piece of equipment cash, that's not an expense. It's just converting to an asset. So you got to be aware of that. The cash flow on any kind of asset, your trucks, your debt, things like that. Any kind of investment activity. Investment activities don't show up on, your P&L, like if you're buying any kind of real estate, equipment, land, things like that. So all your operating activities show up on your P&L. So things like running the business in and out, but it's financing and investment activities that don't get reflected there. They're on the cash flow statement.
So I go through just like my monthly bill off my credit card to figure out what I'm spending a month on, not use the P&L. That should be considered my monthly burn rate.
Yeah, if you figure out how much cash you actually spend for the month on average,
Not go through the P&L.
yeah, that'd be your burn rate. So that's cash out, your negative cash flow for the month.
Can't figure it out on P&L. I give up.
We can work on that. You can just punch it all on the sheet on what you're spending, and it will tell you what your monthly flow is.
Just to clarify, the burn rate does not include overhead expenses, or it does?
It does. It's all your negative cash flow.
Balance sheet.
Yeah, like debt service and all that. Owner's draw, debt service, and all the overhead would be kind of your burn rate. It'd be how much it costs you a month to exist if you had zero work. Yeah, Lyle.
Yeah, especially when it comes to finance, you don't know what they'll do. So what is, have you seen that the most miscategorized item on
The most miscategorized item on the P&L. Honestly, it's field labor. Most people have field labor down, just wages and one line, all office admin, everybody's one payroll line on their P&L statement. And so what that does, and the issue with that, is it leads you to believe that your markup and margin are much, much larger than they really are, because you look at your revenue number and your gross margin number, and labor's not factored into that. So you think your margin is massive and that you're killing it and you've got all this extra margin because your field guys are hidden down in the bottom and they're coming out before net. So that's why you got to know net, gross, and revenue. But I see that just not listed as a COGS, basically. You know, field guys, things related to that. You know, we did a big cleanup for Swamp Rabbit because that's how theirs was. Everything was down below the fold. And they thought they were killing their gross margin. They're like, man, we're absolutely like 70-some% and overkilling it. And then when we moved everything where it needs to go, we got a real number out that was more in line with what they projected. And if your accountant can't move those in QuickBooks, just give me a call. I can do it in less than 3 minutes and record you a Loom video on how to do it. I don't care, it's fine. I did it for Swamp Rabbit. Yeah, and overhead, usually legal fees is down on the P&L. And so all your legal fees go there. If you have a lawyer on retainer or anything like that, it's all just a legal expense on your P&L. It's not gonna be a direct cost. I guess you could have a money recovery cost, but if you're an accrual based, you know, it's already accounted for and then it comes out. So you still made the money on the job, you just spent legal fees to collect. Yeah. So in the breakout session, we're gonna do a breakout. I want you guys to really dig through what your overhead expenses are for your business, and you can talk about that and build out overhead budgets for at least Q1 for 2024 so that you know kind of where you're taking your business, and then you can backtrack into, based on your revenue, what margin you need to support your business. And we can talk about that more in the breakout session. So take 5 minutes and then head to your breakout places. We did it. It's over. It's over.